Welcome to Good News from St. Andrew's, Guelph. I'm your host, the Reverend John Borthwick, and it is my pleasure to be with you each and every week here on Rogers TV 20. I must say, I miss being in community with other people, and I'm sure that you do too. This stay-at-home order that we've been on for quite some time now, and it looks like it may be extended, has been difficult for so many of us, including myself. And this past year and more of not being together in worship, to be together to see each other and to walk through some of the journeys that some of us have sadly been on, where they've lost loved ones or have been going through rough and difficult times, has certainly taken its toll for so many of us. And I so look forward to the day when again we will be in person. And from everything I'm hearing, everything I understand about the situation we're in, the way of getting there is by getting vaccinated. Now, I understand that's a personal choice for every single individual, essentially on this earth, I suppose. It's a personal choice whether or not one is going to participate in a vaccination program. But until we hit that magic percentage of people in our community who are vaccinated, then we will continue to experience lockdowns and stay-at-home orders. We'll continue to see infections happen and people being sent to the ICU. We'll continue to be living in a space where we can't do everything that we would normally want to do or be able to do. The good news that I'm hearing from our public health unit here in Wellington, Dufferin, and Guelph is amazing. We had the chance to speak to Dr. Tenenbaum. He's the Associate Medical Officer of Health for our public health unit here in this region. Had a conversation with him just last Friday and was very inspired by the good news that's there. Things about the vaccination supply is coming and increasing in our community. The effectiveness of the vaccines are quite amazing, and all the research and amazing, yes, everyday changing kind of stuff that they're wrestling with and dealing with is certainly quite inspiring. Very grateful to our public health unit and all the public health units across the country who've had to step up in this very challenging time. So all that to say, if you can, if you're able, please pre-register for a vaccination today, whether that's your first dose or waiting for your second. Please consider getting vaccinated so that we can quicken the time of being together in person so much sooner and get on with some of the things that we are looking forward to and longing to do when restrictions are lifted. So all that to say, all this conversation around being together actually leads me straight into our conversation for our worship service for this week. The disciples were together for so much time following the resurrection of Jesus. And not only were they together, but Jesus was with them in person. And what a time that must have been. The Bible says, and the Gospels say, it was about 40 days from when Jesus was resurrected from the dead till about this time that we come to today in the church year called Ascension Sunday. And so Jesus had gone through whatever he'd experienced, then he appears to a variety of different people and then seems to be in community with the disciples and those who were following him for about 40 more days. Over a month. Can you imagine what that must have been like to be hanging out with the resurrected Jesus? Well, at this day that we mark in our church year, Jesus is ascending. It's the Ascension Sunday, and for a lot of us, that's a bit of a different kind of thing of what are we talking about when we say this? Jesus is about to leave his disciples. They've been together for over a month, and now he's leaving. And so it brings up this question, what is ascension? Now, over this past year, I hope you've heard me say a number of times that there are things that we hear and read in our Bibles, the story of God, that for some of us, we're quite comfortable taking it absolutely literally, that it happened exactly the way the Bible tells the story. And then for others of us, we're just not exactly sure. Is it meant to be more figurative? Is it meant to be a story that's illustrative of a different kind of point that the story of God wants to get across? And then for maybe even others of us, it's just something that we're not exactly sure that we can fully embrace. There's so much mystery and unknowns within the life and journey of faith that we experience of trying to follow Jesus, that some of us are much more comfortable just sticking with some of the tangibles, as opposed to these things that seem beyond us. So let me walk us through just a couple of different ways of looking at this ascension story. So what is ascension? Well, ascension is really this idea and concept of Jesus ascending, leaving the earth and ascending to heaven. Now, I've got to pull this back a touch, because for the people that lived in Jesus' day, they had a fairly strong belief of how things worked in the world. They believed that earth was one thing, and that below them there was what we call the bad place, hell, and then above them, above the sky, and for some in the ancient world, it was this notion of once you hit above the clouds, you were actually entering the space of God, or the gods, depending on where you came from. And so when we hear about Jesus ascending into the clouds, for those who wrote the story in that time and day, you could take it absolutely literally. Jesus is with his disciples, he gives them some parting words, and then he starts to leave the earth and ascend into the heavens, or to heaven itself. Now, this is a story that's told in the book of Acts, which is sometimes referred to as Luke Part 2. And it's really the continuation of the Gospel of Luke of after Jesus ascends, what happens next and what does the early church get up to. With this ascension into heaven, this literal view of it is that Jesus has literally bodily left the earth and has departed from his friends and is now residing in heaven. For some of us, when we hear that story, we understand that it ticks the box or does what it's supposed to do as the story of Jesus was told. He was to come to this earth and live this life. He was to suffer and die. He was to be resurrected on the third day. Then he was to ascend into the heavens and sit on the right hand of God the Father, that kind of language around the church. And then somehow the Spirit was meant to be given, and that's for next week. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. So you could just see it as a literal thing. Jesus ascends to heaven and therefore checks the box or does what Jesus is called to do as the Messiah. Another way of looking at this story, and I wonder if this is a helpful way of seeing it, with this idea of yes and. So yes, a literal story, and something else. Something more figurative, something more illustrative of what we're witnessing as a story is told. And this is where I find this story in particular so amusing, so interesting, so clever. You see, the picture is that all these disciples are looking up as Jesus ascends. And there are other stories, just to be clear, there's other stories in the Bible of ancient characters, actually some pretty important ones that get mentioned in the Gospels, of them disappearing into the heavens. Elijah is one of the prophets from way before. He gets a fiery chariot to disappear into the heavens with. Not for Jesus, he just ascends, floats up into the sky. But if you can imagine the story being told where Jesus is ascending into heaven and everybody's looking up into the clouds, it's sort of that idea that when you're in a crowded space with lots of people, my goodness, wouldn't that be interesting to be in those kind of spaces again? And somebody looks up, as human beings, we all start looking up and wondering, what is that person looking at? And behind them, the story goes, a couple of people, beings, ask them that very question. What are you looking at? And I think that question is really what it's about. Is it as sort of the impetus to push the early church to to go and do what it's called to do, to be witnesses to the ends of the earth. And so what's fascinating about that clever way of putting it, where everyone's looking up and these guys say, what are you looking at? Because really the reality is here and now on the earth. What are you going to do now to be witnesses to Jesus, to the community that is tangibly right in front of your eyes? Not up there, but here. Where are you looking? Here and now, not up there. And then one other take on this yes and. So literal story. Yes, and maybe a figurative story of where are we supposed to put our focus now that Jesus has left us to be his body in the world. And the Iona community, the Celtic tradition of Christianity from the Iona in Scotland, they have this beautiful way of describing the ascension as Jesus going into the heavens so that his reach can be universal, or so that he can be present with us always. Isn't that an interesting thing? And I'm not saying that Jesus had his arms out like a bird, but you know, that sort of spread of one's wings, the images that I talked about last week around God being like an eagle with long wingspan, wrapping all of God's brood in God's wings. Wonder if that's the way it looked, like Jesus lifting up into the heavens, and so that his arms would wrap in a cosmic kind of way around the entire earth, or maybe this universal cosmic kind of Christ. Again, maybe that's a bit much for some, but it's another way of looking at this story. Because really the mystery of Jesus and the mystery of what we try to trust in as we try to follow Jesus is really something about faith. It's about, you know, believing in something that you're not really sure. You don't have all the tangibles. But consider this mystery and this sort of paradox of the way we understand who Jesus is. Jesus as somebody who is indisputably dead actually is more alive than any one of us. Jesus, someone who appears to leave, to depart, to go away from his disciples, is now present with us even more than ever before, even to the ends of the age, and certainly to all the ends of the earth. And we think that's pretty good news, and that's good news worth sharing. So today's service from May the 16th, 2021, comes to us from the book of Acts, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. And you'll see in the service and hear the story of this ascension of Jesus. So happy Ascension Sunday to you all, and may your days be filled with more good news than bad.